James kicked a small rock down the cracked sidewalk, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. The early autumn air carried the faint scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke, but James barely noticed. He was too busy thinking about how empty his afternoons had become ever since his friends got caught up in sports and after-school activities. He didn't have the money to join them, and his mom was already working overtime just to keep up with the bills. As he walked past the old White House on the corner, something caught his eye. An elderly woman, frail but well-dressed, was standing in her front yard, staring at a pile of fallen branches blocking her porch steps. She had a cane in one hand and a slightly frustrated look on her face. James hesitated. He didn't know much about her except that she lived alone. He'd seen her a few times, always dressed neatly, always walking carefully down the street, but they had never spoken. He could just keep walking after all, it wasn't his problem. But something about the way she stood there, shifting her weight as if debating whether she should try to move the branches herself, made him stop. "Need some help?" he asked, stepping closer. The woman turned to look at him, her sharp blue eyes studying him for a moment before she nodded. "That would be very kind of you, young man." James stepped forward and started picking up the branches. Some were thin and brittle, others thick and heavy. He worked quickly, stacking them neatly beside the walkway. The woman watched him, leaning on her cane. "You live around here?" she asked after a moment. "Yeah, just down the street," James replied, brushing dirt from his hands. "I thought I'd seen you before," she said. "I'm Dorothy Hughes." "James Carter," he said with a small nod. "Well, James Carter, I appreciate this more than you know," she said warmly. "I was just about to call someone to come take care of it, but they never seemed to show up on time." James glanced at the pile of branches. "I don't mind helping. It's not a big deal." Dorothy smiled. "It is to me." She shifted slightly, wincing as she adjusted her stance. James noticed the way she favored one side, her left leg looking stiff. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Oh, just old bones and an even older injury," she said with a small chuckle. "Nothing worth worrying about." James wasn't so sure, but he didn't push. He finished clearing the last of the branches and wiped his hands on his jeans. "There," he said, "all done." Dorothy looked at the cleared path and smiled. "You did a wonderful job. Would you like to come inside for some lemonade? I just made a fresh pitcher this morning." James hesitated. He didn't want to be rude, but he also wasn't sure if he should. Then again, he didn't have anywhere to be, and the idea of sitting down for a bit sounded nice. "Sure," he said. Dorothy led him inside, moving carefully as she walked. Her house was neat and filled with old-fashioned furniture, the kind James had only seen in movies. It smelled like lavender and something faintly sweet like cookies. She poured them both a glass of lemonade and sat down in a chair near the window. James took a sip, surprised at how good it was. "You live alone?" he asked after a moment. Dorothy nodded. "My husband passed away years ago. Have family, but they're all busy with their own lives." James understood that feeling all too well. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Dorothy spoke again. "You're a good boy, James. Not many would stop to help an old woman." James shrugged. It just seemed like the right thing to do. Dorothy smiled, and for the first time in a while, James felt like maybe his afternoons weren't so empty after all. James found himself stopping by Dorothy's house more often after that first afternoon. At first, it was just small things, checking in to see if she needed anything, helping her carry groceries from her car or raking leaves in her yard. She never asked him to, but he could tell she appreciated it. Their conversations became longer, and before he knew it, their visits became part of his routine. Dorothy had a way of telling stories that made time pass quickly. She talked about her younger years, about how she and her late husband had traveled across the country in their early days, about the people she had met and the places she had seen. James hadn't traveled much. His world had always been small, just school, home, and the few blocks in between. He liked listening to her stories. They made him feel like he was seeing something beyond the everyday struggles his mom faced, beyond the limits of their small town. One afternoon, James arrived to find Dorothy struggling to lift a heavy bag of birdseed from her car. He hurried over and took it from her hands before she could protest. "You know, you could have waited for me," he said, carrying the bag toward her back porch. Dorothy chuckled. "I may be old, but I'm not helpless." James shook his head with a grin. "Still, I don't think lifting heavy bags is the best idea." She sighed, settling into a chair on the porch as he poured some of the birdseed into a feeder. "I suppose you're right," she admitted. "I just like being able to do things on my own." James understood that. His mom was the same way, always insisting she could handle everything even when he knew she was exhausted. As he finished filling the feeder, Dorothy watched him with a thoughtful expression. "James, do you have any plans for after high school?" James hesitated. It wasn't a question he liked thinking about. "Not really," he admitted. "College isn't really an option right now. My mom's already working extra just to keep things steady." Dorothy nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're a hard worker," she said. "That's something not everyone has." James shrugged, not sure what to say. He didn't feel like he had much of a choice. They sat in silence for a moment before Dorothy spoke again. "You remind me of my husband when he was young," she said softly. "He didn't come from much either, but he worked hard and built a good life for us." James wasn't sure if she was trying to encourage him or just reminiscing, but either way, he appreciated it. As the weeks passed, James continued helping Dorothy with the small tasks around her house. She never treated him like a chore boy or just some kid. Instead, she treated him like a friend. One evening, as James was getting ready to leave, Dorothy placed a small envelope in his hand. He looked down at it, confused. "What's this?" he asked. "A little something for your time," she said with a gentle smile. James shook his head and tried to hand it back. "I don't want money for helping you." Dorothy's smile didn't waver. "I know that, dear, but sometimes kindness should be recognized." James hesitated before carefully placing the envelope on the table. "Spending time here is enough," he said earnestly. Dorothy studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You have a good heart, James." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just gave her a small smile before heading home. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Dorothy's stories, about the way she talked about her late husband, about the way she seemed to understand things he hadn't even said aloud. For the first time in a while, he felt like he had someone who truly saw him. November brought colder days, and with it, a distinct chill that made the trees look even more barren. James had grown used to his routine with Dorothy helping her around the house, listening to her stories, and sharing bits of his own life. It was something he looked forward to, something that made his days feel a little fuller. One afternoon, as he was stacking firewood near Dorothy's back porch, she came outside with 2 steaming mugs of hot cocoa. She handed one to him and settled into a chair, watching as he wiped his hands on his jeans before taking a sip. "I wanted to ask you something, James," she said after a moment. James glanced over at her. "What's that?" She cupped her mug between her frail hands, her fingers slightly trembling from the cold. "Thanksgiving is coming up," she said. "Do you and your mother have plans?" James hesitated. "Not really. She's working that day, and it's just the 2 of us, so we don't do much." Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. "Would you like to have dinner here? I know it won't be much of a grand feast, but I'd like the company." James was caught off guard. He hadn't expected the invitation, but the idea of spending the holiday alone didn't exactly sound appealing either. "I'd like that," he said after a moment. Dorothy smiled, satisfied with his answer. As Thanksgiving approached, James helped Dorothy prepare for the day. She wasn't able to move around the kitchen as easily as she once had, so he took on most of the heavy work peeling potatoes, stirring sauces, lifting the heavy roasting pan. She directed him from her chair by the counter, laughing every time he fumbled with something new. "You're learning," she said as he struggled to mash the potatoes without sending them flying. "Barely," he muttered, but he couldn't help grinning. On Thanksgiving Day, James arrived early, carrying a small store-bought pumpkin pie he had managed to get with what little money he had saved from odd jobs. Dorothy beamed when she saw it. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said. He shrugged, figured it wouldn't feel right showing up empty-handed. The dinner itself was simple but warm roast chicken instead of turkey, a small spread of mashed potatoes, stuffing, and green beans. They ate slowly, talking in between bites, sharing stories about past holidays. Dorothy told him about the Thanksgiving she and her husband had spent stranded in a snowstorm, making a meal out of canned goods and laughing about it for years afterward. James, in turn, told her about the last time his mom had managed to get Thanksgiving off work, how they had spent the whole day cooking together, only to burn half of it. He missed that. As the evening wound down, James helped Dorothy clean up, both of them moving at an easy pace, neither in a hurry for the night to end. When he finally got up to leave, Dorothy placed a hand on his arm. "I'm thankful for you, James," she said softly. He swallowed against the sudden lump in his throat. "Me too." December arrived with its biting wind and early darkness. James noticed Dorothy moving slower, her steps more careful, her pauses more frequent. She never complained, but he could tell she was feeling the cold in her bones. One evening, as he helped her bring in some firewood, he caught her rubbing her temples, her eyes squeezed shut for a moment. "You okay?" he asked. She opened her eyes and offered him a small smile. "Just a bit of a headache, nothing to worry about." James wasn't convinced, but he didn't push. A few days later, he knocked on her door and got no answer. Frowning, he knocked again, louder this time. When she still didn't respond, he tried the knob. The door was unlocked. A sinking feeling settled in his chest as he stepped inside. "Dorothy," he called. A silence. His heart pounded as he moved through the house, finally finding her in the living room, slumped in her chair. "Dorothy," he rushed to her side, panic flooding his veins. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "James," she murmured. He exhaled in relief but quickly realized something was wrong. Her skin was pale, and she looked weaker than he had ever seen her. "I'm calling someone," he said firmly, reaching for his phone. "No hospitals," she said weakly. "Dorothy, you need help." She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before nodding slightly. "Fine, but just a doctor, not the hospital." James wasted no time calling for help. A few minutes later, a local doctor who still made house calls arrived. James stepped aside as the doctor examined her, his own hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through him. After a thorough check, the doctor turned to James. "She's dehydrated and exhausted, likely hasn't been eating or drinking enough these past few days." He glanced at Dorothy. "You need rest, no skipping meals, and definitely no more pushing yourself too hard." Dorothy gave a weak chuckle. "I'll try." James didn't find it funny. "You scared me," he admitted quietly. Dorothy looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read before reaching out and squeezing his hand. "I'm still here." That night, James stayed longer than usual, making sure she ate a full meal before he left. As he walked home, he realized just how much she had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was family. Dorothy slowly regained her strength over the next few weeks, though James made sure she didn't push herself too hard. He stopped by every day, bringing her small meals and making sure she stayed hydrated. She never protested too much, just giving him that knowing smile as if she understood that he wouldn't take no for an answer. One afternoon, as he sat in her living room, she looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "James," she said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about something important." He set down the book he had been flipping through. "What is it?" She folded her hands in her lap, seeming to gather her thoughts. "You've done so much for me these past few months, more than I ever could have asked for." James shrugged. "I just wanted to help. You don't have anyone else around and, well, I like being here." Dorothy smiled warmly. "And I like having you here, but also know that you have your own life to think about, your future." James shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like thinking about the future because it always felt uncertain, filled with obstacles he wasn't sure how to overcome. Dorothy reached into the small side table next to her chair and pulled out a sealed envelope. She handed it to him. "What's this?" he asked, frowning. "Open it," she urged. James hesitated before carefully tearing open the envelope. His eyes widened as he pulled out a cashier's check. He blinked, reading the amount twice just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. It was for $10,000. His heart pounded. "Dorothy, I can't take this." His voice was shaky, caught between shock and disbelief. "Yes, you can," she said firmly, "and you will." He looked up at her, completely lost for words. "Why? I didn't help you for money." "I know that," she said softly. "That's exactly why I want to do this. James, you've given me something I haven't had in a long time. You've made me feel like I wasn't alone. You've cared for me when no one else did. That kind of kindness is rare." James swallowed hard, but this is too much. Dorothy shook her head. "My husband and I lived a simple life, but we were smart with our money. I've set aside more than I'll ever need. I want to use it to help someone who deserves it, someone like you." James stared at the check, his hands trembling slightly. $10,000. That was more money than he had ever seen in his life. It could help his mom with bills, it could help him start thinking about college, it could change everything. But still, he hesitated. Dorothy reached out and placed a gentle hand over his. "James, I want you to have this. Not as charity, but as gratitude. You've given me more than you realize. Let me do this for you." He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought about all the afternoons they had spent together, all the ways she had unknowingly given him a sense of purpose when he felt like he had none. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dorothy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You deserve it." As James walked home that evening, the envelope tucked securely inside his jacket, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. James sat on the edge of his bed, the envelope resting in his hands. The weight of it wasn't just in the paper, but in everything it represented. He had never had this kind of money before, never even considered the possibility of having a financial cushion. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. He thought about what Dorothy had said, about how she wanted to help him because he had helped her. He knew she meant it, and yet part of him still struggled with accepting it. But turning it down wouldn't change anything. Dorothy had made up her mind, and he knew she wouldn't take it back. The next morning, James sat across from his mother at the kitchen table. She was exhausted from another long shift, stirring sugar into her coffee absent-mindedly. "I need to tell you something," James said, his voice careful. His mother looked up, her tired eyes instantly filled with concern. "What is it?" He pulled the check from the envelope and placed it in front of her. Her eyes widened as she stared at the amount. "James," she breathed, how did you get this?" He took a deep breath. Dorothy gave it to me. She wanted to help. His mother's expression flickered between shock, confusion, and something unreadable. James, we can't just take money from an elderly woman. She insisted, he said firmly. She told me she had more than she needed, and that this was her way of thanking me for helping her these past few months. His mother's lips pressed together. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same one he had felt when Dorothy first gave it to him. Mom, this could change things for us, he continued gently. It could help with bills, maybe even help me start thinking about school. His mother exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. I don't want to take advantage of her kindness. You're not, James assured her. Neither of us are. She wanted to do this, and I think saying no would hurt her more than taking it. His mother studied him before finally nodding. Okay, she said softly. We'll use it wisely. Relief washed over him. Over the next few weeks, life began to change in small but significant ways. The stress in his mother's eyes eased just a little as she caught up on overdue bills. The weight on James's shoulders felt lighter, knowing that they had a bit of breathing room. He visited Dorothy as often as always, but now their conversations shifted. She asked him what he wanted to do next, what dreams he had now that money wasn't such an immediate barrier. I don't know, he admitted one afternoon as they sat in her living room. I never really thought about it before. College always felt impossible. Dorothy smiled knowingly. And now? James exhaled. Now, I think I might actually have a chance. She patted his hand. You do, James, and you always did. You just needed someone to remind you of that. As winter faded into spring, James found himself looking at colleges for the first time, actually considering a future he had once thought was beyond his reach. Dorothy continued to support him, offering advice, sharing stories from her own past, and always reminding him that he was capable of more than he realized. One afternoon, as he helped her plant flowers in her garden, she looked at him with a satisfied expression. You know, she said, when I first met you, I never imagined just how much you'd change my life. James chuckled. I think you've changed mine more. She shook her head. No, James, we've changed each other's. And as he knelt in the dirt, planting another flower beside hers, he realized she was right.